New technologies and improvements to old technologies led to enormous casualties during World War I. The creation of the machine gun, which the first machine guns were developing at the end of the Civil War, but the Civil War ended before they could really get their feet underneath them and really be used. Well, the machine gun, which is designed to fire hundreds of bullets per minute, became more refined and improved, and it was very lethal, especially if you thought about these trenches. If you could take a machine gun into a trench and just sweep, the casualties were catastrophic. Okay. One of the most famous machine guns that, kind of come out of World War One is the Tommy gun. Okay, very popular under the gangsters and things during Prohibition in Chicago and places like that. It was used at the end of World War One, and that really became a lethal killing machine. Tanks are also introduced during World War One. You have heavily armed vehicles that use treads instead of wheels to maneuver. And this is important because in those muddy trenches, you get bogged down with wheels. These tracks can go across no man's land. They could face intense gunfire. They could plow directly into the trenches. The image you see right there is actually George S. Patton, who will become a famous general during World War II. He led the 1st Armored Division in World War I. He was one of the first tank commanders in World War I. Planes are also used for the first time in this war. It's only been 11 years since the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. At first, they're just kind of used as reconnaissance. They use cameras to take pictures of troop movements and report back and things like that. But soon we have one-on-one battles happening in the air where pilots are just using their sidearms, their pistols, shooting at each other. Eventually, the government and the military guys are like, hey, we could probably put guns on these things and they could do some damage. So they do. Okay? Being a pilot is one of the most dangerous jobs in this war. New pilots only survive 3 to 6 weeks in combat conditions. In the United States, the American ace, Eddie Rickenbacker, becomes infamous when he shoots down 26 enemy planes, and he actually receives a Medal of Honor for his heroism. And then the gentleman on the bottom there is Manfred von Richthofen. We may know him as the Red Baron. He's the German ace. He shoots down 80 Allied planes, recorded Allied planes during the war. Airships are also used during this war. They're gigantic balloons filled with lighter than air gas like helium, and they are used for conducting aerial surveillance of troop movements as well. Anti-aircraft guns are developed during this time because now there are things in the sky, and so they have to take heavy artillery, modify it so they can actually point it up to the sky and fire at airships or airplanes. Also, a strategy that the United States and the Allies begin to use to get supplies across the Atlantic are convoys, which are groups of destroyers and other warships that make it harder for U-boat attacks to happen and destroy ships. They're armed with torpedoes and guns and depth charges, which are bombs that can explode under the water, and they are used to escort those merchant ships that are taking those supplies. So, as all of this is happening, there's also some political things happening. In 1917, the Russian Revolution occurs. Some Russian revolutionaries overthrow the monarchy, Tsar Nicholas and his family, and he's ousted and they are murdered in the summer of 1917. And the new government that's established, which is trying to become a democracy at that point, pulls out of the war. They sign a peace treaty with Germany. Now Germany doesn't have to worry about fighting on the Eastern Front. They turn and they focus solely on the Western Front, which makes it even more important that the Allies, specifically the United States, gets their rear in gear and gets to Europe to start supporting the French and the British. Okay. In 1918, millions of American soldiers arrive in France, and they're fresh, and they're well-fed, and they're ready to fight. And what's interesting about World War I is that there are many minority groups that fight, and a lot of immigrants that fight. At home, they're still facing a lot of discrimination, but they serve with distinction. Many honors are given, many medals of honors, Navy crosses. Asian Americans, many of them served and received their citizenship through serving their country. We had Hispanic Americans, though, who were some of those conscientious objectors or those people who refused to register for the draft because of discrimination that was still happening to them, especially in the American Southwest. African Americans served in segregated units. The thing that I find very, very interesting is that there's only 3 units who actually see fighting in World War I. And those 3 units are all under French control. The African American units under American control are kept behind the scenes, digging trenches, driving trucks, those kinds of things. And it's very interesting how the impact of what those 3 divisions saw in France was so different to how they were treated in the United States. And we'll take a look at that a little bit later too. Many soldiers, both white and black, were impressed with Europe's liberating ideas of race and sexuality, and, you know, this idea of kind of ushering in that roaring 20s, this idea of fun, and you can go out and drink and dance and smoke and, you know, have fun. Now, as we continue to talk about how weaponry and militarism are improving, World War I sees the introduction of the use of poisonous gas. Germany is the first to use it in 1915, but it will be used by both sides. And it is absolutely devastating what this gas can do. So essentially, this gas is heavier than air, and so it goes and it creeps down into those trenches and it fingers out. And what these gases do, it's mustard gas for the most part, which is now illegal to use. But what it does is it essentially sucks the air out of you. Like, you cannot breathe. And so you end up most of the time suffocating to death. Living in these trenches, it's hard to imagine what that would be like. The constant shelling, the disease, there are rats, there are dead bodies in there. They go on for miles, the stench, the sounds. And so World War I is when we really start to begin to see documented cases of what they call shell shock. Today we call it PTSD, okay? It's this mental illness that comes from this constant bombardment and trauma that's happening to you as a soldier. And it's usually seen with extreme nervousness. You can't sleep. You have severe emotional problems, all right? And so we start to see this new mental health crisis coming out of World War I. And then just the sanitary conditions of the trenches. Standing water. If you're standing in water, you get wet feet. You get wet feet, you get trench foot, which is essentially like your feet begin to rot off you. And there are even accounts of this being so muddy that soldiers, especially soldiers who are wounded, they end up drowning in the mud in the trenches. There are some things that come out of this war, right? Even the terrible machinery and things that are coming out of it are advancements, but also human advancements. Women are very, very much a major part of the forces in Europe. They drive ambulances. They serve as nurses. They become what they call call girls, and these are women are sitting at switchboards, telephone operators, getting communications back and forth across, battlefields and things like that. So it's really one of the first times. I mean, we saw in the Civil War, women played more of a supporting role at home. And just like what we talked about in the Civil War and is more famous in World War II, women are also in the factories back at home, building the machinery that the men need in Europe. Julia C. Stimson, she becomes the chief nurse of the Red Cross in France and the head of nursing for the AEF. And she is awarded many, many medals from U.S., Britain, and France for bravery and life-saving services she provided throughout the war. Every racial and ethnic group in the United States is affected economically and culturally by the war. Germans, they, again, are viewed with suspicion. Many of them lose a lot of their culture because German language newspapers are shut down. Speaking German in many states were banned. Some minority groups, though, saw positive changes. Jewish Americans, for example. Before the war, they grouped by their country of origin. Okay, so it'd be like Polish Jews are together, German Jews are together, so on and so forth. But now the Jewish Americans had kind of bonded together to play a stronger international role. And they formed a lot of the charities that help with orphans in Europe and sending food and supplies and things like that, and helping donate money to the victims of war in Europe. Mexican Americans, who are workers living in the southern and southwestern states, begin to move north to fill some of those job vacancies in factories that have been left by the men going to Europe. Because in the end, employers would still much rather hire a man, whether a minority or not, than a woman. Many women do, though, however, go into paying jobs during this time. African Americans at this time are leaving the South in large numbers because of natural disasters that are destroying the agricultural sector in the South, but also they're moving to the North to fill these jobs. And we call this the Great Migration, which is a massive movement of African Americans. They left the South for cities in the North beginning in 1910. And between 1914 and 1920, more than 600,000 African Americans moved north, but they're still met with hostilities. Again, I tell you not to get caught up in this idea that the North was this equality for everyone, everyone's welcome. There is still a lot of racism and prejudice in the North, even following the Civil War. Wilson and the Democrats also resisted efforts to try and reduce. There were things they could have done. You have Ida Tarbell at this time doing the Anti-Lynching League and things like that. You have the NAACP, you have Webb Du Bois, all these guys who are fighting for legislation. And Woodrow Wilson and the Democrats, and quite frankly Republicans too, aren't really too worried about that, right? So another thing that is happening is we're seeing an increase in a fight for temperance. Saloons and bars are in every city across America, and it had been a thing. That's a very European tradition. Working men went to these bars to socialize. Women are not permitted. So where are the women? Well, the women are at home with their children. The Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union is developed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And what they are really arguing is that saloons encourage drunkenness and overspending by the men. It was destroying families because men would spend all the money, so the children are starving, the women don't have money to buy things that they need to be able to provide for their family. Also, of course, violence comes with alcoholism and things like that. And so these people championed this idea of prohibition, making the sale of liquor illegal. During the war, the prohibition movement gained ground, a lot of ground. Part of that is a lot of the brewers are German, and with anti-German sentiment extremely high during this time, it kind of gives them a foothold. So the 18th Amendment is ratified in January of 1919, and this prohibits the sale of all alcohol in the United States. It's also has the Volstead Act passed by Congress, which is the measure to enforce that prohibition ban in the 18th Amendment. Okay. Wilson's re-election campaign in 1916, while focused more on the economy and war, left out another social issue that was really gaining traction at the time, and that's women's voting rights. In 1917, women were picketing the White House. I want you to recall back that in 1883, Wyoming was the first state that allowed women to vote. And slowly states had been allowing women to vote, but it was still not a nationwide thing. And there were really two factions of this. So in 1917, these women that are picketing the White House are led by Alice Paul, who's the lady you see up in the top right-hand corner. And she's like the militant arm of the women's suffragettes, right? She thinks there needs to be a national amendment to the U.S. Constitution to allow women to vote. And she is very vocal. And they're using the U.S.'s involvement in the war and the need for women to be playing more important roles in factories and in the war effort to help strengthen their cause. In August of 1920, the 19th Amendment is passed, and this gives women the right to vote, okay? But there's still a fight for equality. Following the war, women lose their jobs because the men come home, and they were expected to just go back to their kitchens and start doing what women do. And this is where we really start to see this idea of feminism and women empowerment. At the same time, as we have all this going on, there is a global pandemic happening. Okay, so when COVID happened in 2020, many scientists, historians kind of harkened back to 1918. So in 1918, a powerful strain of influenza, which is a highly contagious illness, we call it the flu, there's one every year, right? There's a flu virus. But this one was extremely powerful, and it begins to sweep across the globe. It becomes known as the Spanish flu. So here's the thing. When you hear that, you hear Spanish flu, you think, oh, it must have come from Spain. Actually, the origins of the Spanish flu that we come to know in 1918 began in the United States in a military camp. The reason it got the name of the Spanish flu is the Spanish government was the first government to openly talk about it and recognize that something was going on. They weren't able to develop a vaccine very quickly. Antibiotics are not common and will not be widespread until the 1940s. And the people that it is most deadly for are the people that are 20 to 40 years old. And that is very unusual. Usually it's either the very young or the very old that have complications. And the thing to keep in mind is this age group, 20 to 40, we're talking about our soldiers, okay? So it becomes a pandemic, which is a sudden outbreak of a disease that spreads over a wide geographic area. It ends up killing 50 million people worldwide. 600,000 of those are Americans. A third of the world's population was infected by the Spanish influenza. And it diverted attention from other important social problems that were happening at the time, okay? The, African American soldiers coming back, immigrants coming back from the war, that civil liberties, civil rights kind of thing. Something I also this is more of just a little factual tidbit. For those of you that know that the nursery rhyme Ring Around the Rosie is about the Black Death, right? There is, interestingly, a nursery rhyme that's created for the Spanish influenza. And you can see it down on the bottom here. Little girls on schoolyards would be jumping rope to this. And they would say, I heard a little bird, and its name was Enza. I opened up the window and influenza. And it was this idea of like, you got to keep your windows closed, and it's going to come in and it's going to swoop and take you away. And I just think that's kind of an interesting little